Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, a friend of mine, Leighton, over in the UK, told me that he had adopted himself to be my manager and that he really thought we needed to talk about King Arthur. So, Leighton, this one's for you. Thought we'd dive in a little bit to the legend of King Arthur. How much of it, if any, is true? What is the origin of that story? Like a lot of stories, I think there's probably some fact that's in there somewhere that was built on to make the legend. So we're going to dive into that a little bit today. I thought we'd take a look at our friends at Kings and Generals. They have a video called King Arthur, The Historical Roots. This is a video that actually came out about 3 years ago. I'll link it down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Few legends are as ubiquitous across the English-speaking world as that of Arthur, King of the Britons. Everyone knows something about Arthurian legend, whether through childhood storybooks or numerous adaptations. Less well known, however, is the fact that the version of King Arthur we all know is not the original one. Hidden.
Yeah, that's the truth with most of these stories, though, right? I mean, the Robin Hood legend the same way. If you go back to the earliest accounts, they're very different than what has developed over time. And if you think about this in your own life, we are all guilty of this. Think about a story that you have told repeatedly from your life. And you get into a rhythm and you tell that story, but at some point you're telling that story and you add a detail that maybe you hadn't added before. And then pretty soon you're always adding that detail. And then you're like, wait a second, did that really happen that way? And it just becomes a part of the lore then.
Amongst the gold-plated knights and Christian artifacts of the high medieval canon are remnants of a much more archaic tale, with its foundations amongst the history and pagan folklore of the ancient Celts of Britain. In this video, we'll explore the roots of the legend and try to figure out if Arthur was a real historical figure. And you can even become a legend of medieval Europe yourself by playing Conqueror's Blade, the sponsor of this video.
So one of the other things, as we're dealing with the ad here, that I think probably plays into all of this is if you think about how many times the culture has changed because of invasions and things like that in Britain. So let's go back to Roman Britain, right? The first couple of hundred years after Christ. And you have the Romans that are there. You had the Celts who were there before that in parts of that region. You have the Picts and others up in the northern part of Britain. And then you have the Angles and Saxons come in, and then you have the Jutes, and you have the Danes, as they call them, the Viking invasion. Then you have the Normans come in. And every time one of these new cultures kind of invades or settles, it brings its own flavor, its own spin on certain stories, and it gets melded in, just like with the language.
The version of the Arthurian myth that most people know is the one developed in the High Middle Ages. So before we get to the deepest roots of Arthurian history, let us summarize the evolution of the medieval legend we're all familiar with. In 1136, English monk Geoffrey of Monmouth finished his magnum opus, a Latin chronicle titled The History and the Kings of Britain.
So one of the things that's fascinating about this time in history, and for several hundred years before that, is that one of the main ways through which we're getting our history is through these monks like the Venerable Bede several hundred years before this. This is one of the most consistently literate classes of people, so it makes a lot of sense that that's who's leaving the stories behind. And it makes me wonder whether we didn't lose some of those incredible writings through the dissolution of the monasteries that happens in the 1500s under Henry VIII, because there were so many of these incredible monasteries that had so much history to them. Hopefully most of that stuff got copied somewhere else.
This tome begins by claiming that the first king of Britain was a Trojan named Brutus, who slew the island's native giant population, and tells a warped version of the Roman conquest and rule over the island.
Yeah, so this makes a lot of sense. Giants are a common theme that you see in a lot of cultures. Even in the Bible talks about the Nephilim, whatever they may have been, and Goliath, stories like that. Seems to be a common thing, kind of like flood stories that exist in many cultures as well. And it also makes a lot of sense that he Geoffrey of Monmouth, who is writing a couple of generations into the Norman rule of England. Norman conquest is like less than 70 years before this, that he's looking back to previous periods. He's looking back to the Roman period and then the Anglo-Saxon period, which had just ended a few decades earlier.
A few chapters later, Geoffrey mentions the prophetic sermon of a certain magician named Merlin, who uses his magic to facilitate the rise of the mighty Uther Pendragon to the British throne. Uther's reign is spent fighting the principal foreign invaders of this era, the Saxons. But later on, he falls in love with his chief rival's beautiful wife, utilizing Merlin's shape-shifting magic to couple with her, thereby producing a bastard child named Arthur. Eventually, Arthur succeeds his father and grows up to be a fine warrior, known for wielding the legendary sword Caliburn. Taking up the burden of the fight against the Saxons, our titular hero subsequently trounces the Saxon king Cerdic at the Battle of Badon. After this, Arthur marries the beautiful Guinevere and then departs to conquer a huge chunk of Europe. Geoffrey rounds off his tale when Arthur's nephew Mordred manages to seduce Guinevere and usurp the British throne.
One common theme through all of history, right, is women being at the center of why men do the things they do. Look at, the story of the Trojan War, all of those sorts of things. It just seems like that's a way that I think you can create something that people can relate to. We do it today. We throw romances into the middle of stories. The whole story of Titanic in the movie is about a romance, right? And Pearl Harbor had to have a love triangle in the center of it.
Forcing the king to return home and duel his treacherous relative, where they both seem to have been fatally wounded at the Battle of Camlan. Geoffrey wasn't the oldest historical chronicler to write about Arthur himself, but with him, Arthurian canon as we know it today first took shape, forged with the inaugural appearance of characters such as Merlin, Guinevere, and the iconic sword Caliburn. Later.
Yeah, so it makes me wonder what the earliest versions of this story look like and whether they weren't based on some real person, whether he was known as Arthur or not. I know there are graves there in England that claim to be the graves of Arthur, or even in Wales. That's what I tend to believe, and even in my own history research, when I've researched people's families, inevitably there's some story about some relative that did something. And what I tell people is not to discount it, but that there was probably some truth to that. When I met my future wife many years ago, I was already into family history, and when I met her father, he told me about an uncle that he had who had been a bodyguard for Abraham Lincoln. And my initial reaction was, yeah, whatever. Your uncle was not a bodyguard to Lincoln. And then as I got into the research, I come to find out that there was this company of soldiers raised by the governor of Ohio, David Todd, who had met with Lincoln and was appalled by the fact that Abraham Lincoln didn't have a bodyguard. And so he asked for permission to raise a company of soldiers who could help serve as a bodyguard to the president. And so he raised this Union Light Guard, and they chose one man from each county in Ohio to serve in this company. And the man chosen from Mahoning County, Ohio, was a guy named Emery Swank, who was indeed their great-great-great-uncle. So there's some truth to it there.
Known as Excalibur. At the time of Historia Regum Britanniae's completion and translation, the culture of Christian nobility was undergoing a metamorphosis. The 12th century had seen an influx of social influence from the Islamic world, from the Crusades and the Reconquista. This had ultimately given rise to rituals of courtly love throughout the nobility, particularly in the French-speaking world. Consequently,
which includes England at this time, right? The language of the court of England is French all the way up until you get to like the time of the 1300s is when you start to see the transition to the language of the court becoming English.
Tales of Arthur captured the public imagination. Enter the French poet Chrétien de Troyes, who, inspired by the works of Monmouth, composed his own anthology of Arthurian tales between the 1170s and 1190s. While Monmouth attempted to cobble together a credible historical chronicle, de Troyes' works read like a blockbuster action-adventure, abound with heart-thumping romances, beautiful maidens, and daring duels.
We still do this today, right? We take the basics of a story and then we infuse it with whatever our modern ideas are of what that story should look like. And so that's why you get, for example, so many different Arthur movies and stories. That's why you get so many different Robin Hood tellings that are all just a little bit different.
It was in the Frenchman's writings that knights such as Gawain, Percival and Lancelot first appear in the high medieval canon. Perhaps the Frenchman's greatest contribution, however, comes in his unfinished Percival the Story of the Grail. In it, the young knight Percival encounters the mysterious Fisher King, ostensibly named because of his fondness for fishing. Percival lodges in his home, which happens to be a mysterious castle of delights where time seems to stand still. There, Percival encounters a procession of beautiful youths carrying a series of magnificent yet mysterious objects, a bloody lance, a set of ornate candelabras, and finally a shallow dish which de Troyes called un Graal. This marks the first time that the Grail appears in the Arthurian canon, although it isn't holy yet. Over the next few centuries, various authors added bits and pieces to the developing canon, during which the Christianization of key themes in the Arthurian mythos became common. This is particularly evident in Robert de Boron's Joseph of Arimathea, which reinterpreted the Grail as the chalice that the titular Saint Joseph used to catch the last drops of Jesus' blood as he hung on the cross.
Yeah, so you see the influence of the culture and of the religion of the day being used to modify the story into something that is digestible by the people at that time who are consuming it.
The next major development came in the 13th century, when the anonymously authored Vulgate Cycle expanded on the quest for the now definitively holy Grail, this time with Lancelot and Gawain on its sanctified trail.
It's fascinating how one author takes the story, another builds on it, and then someone else focuses on a key part of what they added, and then they expand on that thing to where now, everybody knows about the Holy Grail. We've got Indiana Jones movies and stuff about the Holy Grail, and it all goes back to this one dude nearly 1,000 years ago adding something to a story that someone else wrote.
It is here that Arthurian romance as we know it today was more or less fully developed. But as we stated in the beginning, these medieval authors were not the true originators of the Arthurian mythos. To discover those origins, we must jump back nearly 1,000 years, to an era of British history shrouded almost entirely in mystery. The year is now 500 AD, and Britain is inhabited principally by the titular Britons.
So this is pretty cool because by the time you guys are watching this video, I'm pre-recording it, I will be hiking Hadrian's Wall up here in Northumbria, or Northumberland, in the northern part of England. And, it was built at that time when the Roman Britons, 2nd century AD, when you have Hadrian as the emperor, and you're dealing with the Celts and, different groups of people that are inhabiting the northern part of Britain.
Indigenous Celtic people, who up until recently were subjects of Rome, an empire that had abandoned them. In the 5th and 6th centuries, social collapse was the order of the day. No longer supported by the infrastructure of the empire, the most Romanized of the Britons were forced to abandon their heated villas and gridded towns and revert to a more rugged style of living.
Yeah, imagine for a second if in 1860, after the American Civil War, if the folks who had settled California just decided to pull back and go back to the eastern United States and left California. What would happen to it? Who would come in and inhabit that territory? You'd have Native Americans. You would probably have the Spanish again. At that point, you'd probably have the Chinese moving into that area. So it would be a very, very different place. The Mexicans coming up from the south.
While politically, the island fractured into petty kingdoms ruled by warlords, for whom life was cheap and blood flowed freely. To top off an already terrible situation, Germanic tribes like the Angles, Saxons, Frisians and Jutes had left their homelands, and through a mix of conquest and assimilation of the local Romano-Britons, slowly became the masters of eastern Britain, eventually becoming the forebears of the modern English people. Meanwhile, the native Celts who insisted on retaining their culture retreated to the hilly western regions of the island, eventually becoming the ancestors of the modern Welsh people. It is in this era that...
Yeah, the Welsh, you have the Bretons, Brittany, that part of, kind of the peninsula there on northwestern France. You have Ireland, you have Scotland, all with a part of that. But the Celts existed in other places too. There's Celtic influence in Austria and Bavaria.
Arthur first emerges as a pseudo-historical warlord fighting against the Saxons. The name first appears in a 6th century compendium of Welsh poems known as the Gothedin.
See, now this is where it gets really fascinating to me, because now we're talking about pretty close to the time period that these stories are about. And this is where I think, if we look at the details of this part, that there's probably some elements of truth in the story.
Here, a Briton hero named Gwawredur was described as not Arthur amongst equals in the might of feats. This line implies that Arthur was a well-known figure to the 6th century Celts and was considered the benchmark for heroism in his age.
And to me, that in and of itself, you have to, anytime we're reading anything, whether it's ancient writings from this period, histories that are written by somebody like Herodotus or Manetho or Tacitus, or we're looking at stuff that was written in the 1860s, or we're looking at the Bible, it's important to consider the audience, consider the biases of the authors, consider all of that. And if this author at this time is writing about a guy named Arthur as if he's some well-known figure to the people he's writing to at that time, we need to assume that there was somebody of some renown that had that name.
Between the 7th and 10th centuries, the borders with the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had more or less crystallized. Although the Britons had lost much of what would become England.
Yeah, so you have at this time, you have Cornwall, you've got Essex over here and Wessex, and you've got Mercia kind of in the Midlands, you've got Northumbria up here, and you have a lot of other, Kent was a kingdom for a while.
They retained their independence throughout much of Cornwall, Cumbria and Wales, and had even managed to establish states in Brittany. As the age of Saxon invasions faded into generational memory, it became remembered as an era of epic legend. In the courts of the Celtic kingdoms, highly respected bards composed literary epics of warriors who performed great acts of heroism while fighting the Saxons.
You can see how the Celtic peoples would be the ones that would carry this on, since it was one of their stories. And as you have the Anglo-Saxons and then the Normans, coming in, they're wanting to put their stamp on someone else's story.
Meanwhile, monks in Welsh monasteries chronicled the history of their kings in Old Welsh, and it is in these enigmatic pages that we can find the more archaic original Arthur. Other than extremely fragmentary early poems like Gothedin, the oldest surviving account of Arthur in Celtic literature lies in Nennius, a Welsh monk who lived in the 800s. His work, Historia Britannica,
so again, there's that common theme of these being monks that are writing this stuff down,
depicts Arthur as a glory-bound leader who bore the title Dux Bellorum, a Roman word roughly translating to general or warlord. Nennius
but it's the word from which we get the word duke, dux.
Ascribes 12 great battles to Arthur, who leads the Romano-Britons to victory against not just the Saxons, but also their Celtic cousins from Scotland and Ireland. This all culminates.
So now you have him as a Romano-Briton rather than a Celt or an Anglo-Saxon. That's interesting. And I think there's been a modern telling of this story in a movie that has him as a Roman soldier.
In the Dux' ultimate triumph at the Battle of Pagan, where Arthur crushes the Saxons so decisively that he eradicates their hold over Britain for an entire generation. Another manuscript that seems to back up Nennius' testimony of Arthur's deeds is the Annales Cambriae, a compilation of Old Welsh genealogies compiled around the 10th century. The annals speak of the Battle of Pagan, dating it to 514 AD. It also briefly mentions Arthur's end, claiming that in 537 AD, he and Mordred fell in the strife of Camlan. These accounts also line up with those of the aforementioned Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing centuries later.
Right. Well, he's probably building on these accounts.
Theme worth noting in these texts is the more untamed version of Arthur they depict, in contrast to his depiction in the medieval canon. While Geoffrey preserved Arthur's warrior spirit, The medieval French romances that followed depict Arthur more as a regal, castle-bound monarch. Meanwhile, the Welsh Arthur evokes the gritty imagery of a blood-soaked, battle-hardened warlord.
That makes sense because, again, it's about fitting the story into what your culture understands. And writing, in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, it's a society of castles and knights, and that makes sense that that's who they write Arthur to be.
Many other prominent characters appearing in the medieval works also have potential roots in older Celtic literature. The most obvious example of this lies in the medieval Welsh poem, Peredur, son of Evrawc, whose main character and story beats seem to resemble Chrétien's Percival, the Story of the Grail. Although actually not much older than Chrétien's story, the Welsh Peredur is nevertheless theorized to be directly derived from the same ancient Welsh folk story that Chrétien based the Percival romance on. Another place where we can draw these types of parallels lies in another Welsh poem, How Culhwch won Olwen. In it, Culhwch, son of King Cilith of Celithon, is bound by a curse to never marry, lest it is to the beautiful Olwen, daughter of the mighty giant Ysbaddadan.
Another giant.
To that end, Culhwch rides to the court of his cousin, the battle chief Arthur, to ask for aid in winning his beloved's hand. Arthur pledges to help his wayward kinsman, and so he and his best men join Culhwch's cause.
Nothing about the sword in any of this, Excalibur.
These men are the warriors Gwalchmai, Kai, and Bedwyr. Together, they ride for Ysbaddadan's castle, where the giant king has them complete a set of impossible tasks as a condition for giving up his daughter's hand in marriage.
So now you start to have the origins of the story that involve them seeking the Holy Grail. I mean, this is how we know that, for example, they had to fight a killer rabbit outside of a cave, the cave of Caer Banog. And, they had to cross a bridge where they had to answer 3 questions, like what is your name, what is your quest, and what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow.
At one point, Ysbaddadan demands that Culhwch and Arthur fetch for him the prized pseudo-magical cauldron of Diornach, steward of the King of Ireland, and possibly also a giant. Although originally received as guests by the Irish, hostilities quickly bubble once Arthur's men try to take the cauldron. As a fight breaks out, one of Arthur's warriors, Llanlleog, grasps Arthur's sword Caledfwch and uses it to slay Diornach and all of his men. Subsequently, they return to Britain with the cauldron in hand. A few more episodes of
the cauldron becomes the Holy Grail.
Epic adventure follow, culminating in Culhwch eventually obtaining Olwen's hand in marriage and ostensibly living happily ever after. We can see clear similarities between the story of how Culhwch won Olwen and the high medieval Arthurian romances of later centuries. For one, Arthur's warriors in Culhwch seem to be an archaic Welsh version of the Knights of the Round Table. Gwalchmai is an earlier version of Sir Gawain, while Bedwyn and Kai are linked to Sir Bedivere and Sir Kay, who feature in the stories of Geoffrey of Monmouth and Chrétien de Troyes. More dubiously, the Irish-slaying warrior Llanlleog has been theorized to be the root for none other than Lancelot.
Yeah, I mean, these names, they have similarities. It's just like no one called William the Conqueror William. He was Guillaume because he was French. And now we call him William the Conqueror. It's just updating the name to fit the culture.
In addition to this, Culhwch's saga is where Arthur's legendary sword Excalibur makes one of its earliest appearances in extant literature under its original name, Caledfwch, which might just be the old Welsh word for sword. As generations passed, the histories and sagas left behind by the early medieval Welsh were preserved through manuscript or oral tradition. These stories eventually fell into the hands of the high medieval authors. Thus, Celtic warriors and magic cauldrons eventually became chivalrous knights and holy grails. On that note, let us examine another angle by which we can examine the Celtic origins of Arthurian romance, the relics of Celtic paganism still extant in the high medieval stories. Although by the 6th century AD, the Britons were a predominantly Christian people, the stories they told still featured ancient Celtic themes.
As I said earlier, everybody loves to hearken back to the old days to tell a story. How long has our culture been telling World War II stories on movies, right? We're not in that time period anymore. Japan's not our enemy anymore. They're an ally. And Germany, same thing. But we like to tell stories about a time when something was different. And they're doing the same thing.
Such as magic cauldrons, enchanted boars, and capricious pagan gods. These magical elements spotlighted heavily in early Welsh Arthurian literature, and accordingly were then brought into the Latin and French romances, where their pagan roots were whitewashed and replaced with Christianized backstories. The poster child for this retconning is none other than Merlin. In the 13th century, French poet de Boron found Merlin's unexplained magic powers unsuitable for his Christian sensibilities.
Right.
Thus he explained that the sorcerer must have been born as a biblical demon, only to have his evil nature washed away by baptism, allowing him to keep his magic without becoming the Antichrist.
I mean, you have to remember at that time, everything would have been seen through the lens of their Christian faith. Every disease that there was an outbreak of, every king who came to power, every little thing that you saw in nature was explained by your faith.
De Boron has effectively rewritten Merlin so that the Christians could understand and accept him, but the sorcerer's true origins have little to do with Christian scripture. Most of the academia agrees that Merlin's origins lie mainly in Merlin Wicht, a mysterious character who appears in the Annales Cambriae and across several fragmentary Welsh poems. From what we know of Merlin, he was some sort of bard who, upon witnessing the bloody Battle of Arthderith in 573 AD, went mad and fled into the forest, where he lived amongst the beasts and received the gift of prophecy, invoking the imagery of a classic pagan druid, the caste of priests who had been the law keepers of Celtic peoples since ancient times. Pagan roots and Christianization can also be applied to the Holy Grail, which is often compared to the quintessential magic cauldron of Celtic mythology.
Yeah. Whatever you might think about the Dan Brown stories, the Holy Grail was not Mary Magdalene, okay? The Holy Grail wasn't even something that was thought of in biblical times.
Originally associated with the goddess Ceridwen, enchanted cauldrons feature several times throughout the Welsh Arthurian tales. To find one that inspired the Holy Grail, we must look at the story of Branwen, daughter of Clear. This tale features a magic cauldron capable of bringing dead warriors back to life, which is in the possession of an implicitly magical giant king, Bran the Blessed, who was
Bran the Blessed, not Bran the Broken? If you know, you know.
Was mortally wounded in the foot while committing casual acts of genocide in Ireland.
Casual acts of genocide, as one does at that time.
Meanwhile, in Detroit's story of the Grail is a supernatural serving dish of sorts, capable of miraculous acts of healing.
And there's where you see, how the Indiana Jones story connects the Holy Grail. It has that magical healing ability.
It is in the possession of a mysterious, implicitly magical monarch known as the Fisher King, who also suffers chronically from a wound to the leg. Obviously, there are significant parallels between the magic cauldron of resurrection in the Branwen story and the Grail of Chrétien de Troyes story, making the case for the Grail's literary origins as a magic cauldron even stronger.
And when you add in the element of the Grail catching the blood of Jesus, people see the blood of Christ as being, very, very powerful.
Of course, de Boron would later erode away the Grail's implied pagan origins, much as he did with Merlin, this time shackling its backstory to Christian saints and the blood of Jesus Christ. Having thoroughly examined the origins of Arthurian romance and its roots in Celtic folklore, is it possible to confirm whether or not there's any solid historical truth within the legends? Unfortunately, the answer is probably not.
But like we said, where there's smoke, there's fire. These stories came from something. Now, did they come from some creative author's mind? Sure.
Historians can confidently determine is that if he did exist, it was probably in 500 AD during sub-Roman Britain at the age of migrations. Over the centuries, many people have postulated theories on the conditions under which a real Arthur might have existed during this era, depicting him as everything from a pagan Irish warlord to a Roman general to a Sarmatian horse lord. However, the fact of the matter is that none of these theories have enough evidence to stand on, as almost none of the historical Arthurian literature we have today was actually written in the era that he was supposed to have lived in.
And you see that name Arthur becoming a part of Welsh tradition. I mean, even down to when you have Henry Tudor becoming king of England. And Henry Tudor is Welsh, his paternal line is Welsh. And he names his eldest son that's supposed to inherit the throne Arthur. And Arthur was the Prince of Wales, and had he not died at the age of 16, I think it was 16, 15 or 16, then his younger brother Henry, who became Henry VIII, never would have ascended to the throne.
Naturally, the French-Latin medieval stories of the 12th to 15th centuries are decidedly unhelpful in deciphering a real historical figure, as they have distorted their original Celtic source material beyond recognition, and are at least 700 years removed from Arthur's 500 AD time slot. Even the more archaic Welsh texts are historically dubious, as although they were written closer to the so-called Age of Arthur, the oldest of them still only appears a few centuries after his time.
Yeah, but I mean, in the grand scheme of things, when we're looking at, for example, the stories that are written in ancient Greece, a couple hundred years, not that big a deal.
Plenty of time for historical facts to distort into lore and legend.
That's true.
Which clearly happened, given all of the supernatural, magical elements in the Welsh Arthurian tales. So to summarize, it seems as if Arthur occupies a similar historiographic space as the works of Homer, such as the Iliad. Iconic tales of an era long gone, featuring quasi-historical themes, locations and events, but untangleable from the magic and mythology woven into its fabric as the story is retold generation after generation.
Fair.
We will never know if there was ever a true Arthur, but he was real to the medieval courtiers of 14th century France, who modelled their acts of courtly virtue upon the lessons his story set. He was real to the 9th century Welsh shepherds of Powys and Gwynedd, who saw in him their direct ancestor, and a symbol of glory days gone by. Finally, while we may have dismissed his existence in our modern world, the impact that the seminal King of the Britons has had on our culture and social memory will, for centuries yet, remain very real indeed. More videos on the historical realities of legends are on the way.
Alright, so that was good. I enjoyed it. I learned some things I didn't really know. I had a kind of a brief understanding of all of this stuff. So what do you know about it? Some of you probably know a lot more about this topic. Let us know in the comment section below. Let's learn from one another, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.